You open your eyes in the morning, you reach over to your nightstand, and before you even have your first cup of coffee, you were just instantly buried.
Oh, yeah, completely buried.
Right. You open up your news app or, scroll through your social feed, and this absolute avalanche of global events just comes pouring through the screen.
It's overwhelming.
It really is. I mean, there's a volatile political crisis unfolding on one continent, an economic shift shaking markets on another, a natural disaster here, a sudden AI breakthrough there.
Yeah, and sitting there looking at this rushing river of chaotic, disconnected daily news, the sheer volume of it all just feels, well, it feels like a lot.
Exactly. You feel like a tiny raft caught in a flood of just stuff happening. And the fascinating thing is when you step back and look at the broader scope of historical events, it's the exact same feeling.
Right, just rendered in sepia tone.
Yeah, exactly. You look at thousands of years of human civilization, the rise and fall of empires, wars that redraw maps overnight, quiet revolutions in thought. And you can't help but ask yourself a very deep, very persistent question.
Which is, does all this chaos actually mean something?
Yes. Is there a hidden architecture to it all?
Mhm.
Or, is history just a random, endless sequence of things happening until the sun eventually burns out?
That tension you're describing, that is perhaps the ultimate human dilemma. Because biologically, we are pattern-seeking
Oh,
creatures.
totally. We want things to make sense.
Right. When we face the vastness of the past, our deepest cognitive instinct is to demand a pattern. We desperately want the noise and the chaos to resolve into, like, a melody.
We want assurance that the suffering and the triumphs weren't just random dice rolls in a void.
Exactly. But indulging that intense desire for a grand, comforting pattern can lead us into some incredibly treacherous intellectual territory.
And today, we are walking straight into that territory. We're taking a deep dive into the philosophy of history.
It's a fascinating area.
It really is. Specifically, we're going to explore the profound difference between finding meaning in history versus discovering the meaning of history.
And if that sounds like a tiny grammatical quibble, just the simple swap of prepositions, stick with us. That single word represents an absolute chasm in how we understand human existence.
Our guide for this exploration is a really dense, masterful lecture excerpt by the philosopher W.H. Walsh. It's from his essay titled Meaning in History.
Walsh takes on a monumental task here. He's putting two very different ways of thinking under the microscope.
Right. On one side, he looks at how professional historians actually do their grueling everyday jobs.
Yeah, and on the other side, he examines the grand theories of meta-historians and philosophers, the people who try to explain the entire destiny of the human race in a single equation.
So our mission today is to take this incredible text, strip away the academic jargon, and figure out exactly how historians actually construct a coherent past.
And we'll investigate why those grand, overarching theories of history, the ones that try to explain absolutely everything, so often fall apart the minute you poke them.
Most importantly, we're going to look at how you can take these critical thinking skills and apply them to your own daily life. Whether you're analyzing a dense historical biography or just trying to make sense of your morning news feed.
It's highly applicable stuff.
So let's unpack this. Walsh starts his essay by pointing out a massive cognitive trap that almost everyone falls into.
Yeah, he identifies a false binary that infects our thinking before we even open a history book. People assume history must be one of two extremes.
Right, like an either-or situation.
Exactly. Option one is that history is a grand, meaningful, completely intelligible process. A beautifully written story with a clear point, an obvious moral arc, and a final destination.
A meticulously composed symphony.
Yes, and option two is that it's a completely chaotic aggregate of unconnected events, totally lacking rhyme or reason, just a blind collision of atoms.
So either it's a symphony or it's a toddler violently banging on a piano keyboard. There's no middle ground for most people.
And Walsh notes this binary carries a lot of rhetorical weight. We all inherently know that past events can be incredibly dark, brutal, and baffling.
Yeah, the connections are totally obscure to us a lot of time.
But the entire aim of the historian, the reason the profession even exists, is to lessen that darkness, to painstakingly remove the obscurity.
Their goal is to make the past intelligible, given whatever surviving resources they have.
Right. No professional historian would ever accept the statement that history is utterly unintelligible. They'll admit it's difficult, and there are massive gaps in the archives, but they refuse to concede it's impossible.
So by default, if historians spend their lives making sense of it, we have to grant that history is, in some localized sense, meaningful.
Exactly.
Let's focus on that localized sense. Let's look at the historian's toolkit. I think if you polled 100 people on the street and asked what a historian does, 90 of them would picture someone in a dusty archive writing a massive timeline.
Oh, for sure. Just jotting down dates.
Right. They would imagine the job is to write, in 1492 this happened, and in 1493 this happened. But Walsh vehemently rejects that.
He does. A timeline like that is what Walsh calls a mere chronicle or a catalog. It's just raw events in chronological order, completely isolated from one another, pure data.
But the business of historians is never just to build a chronicle.
No, their job is to construct a significant narrative.
Okay, I want to push back on that phrase, significant narrative. It sounds, I don't know, a bit subjective. How do you distinguish a narrative that is significant from a list of facts that is just, well, accurate?
That's the key question. A significant narrative in Walsh's framework becomes self-explanatory. It doesn't just show you the order in which things occurred, it reveals their hidden connections.
So it's about the relationships between the facts?
Exactly. The historian faces a mountain of raw, chaotic data and has to make aggressive analytical choices. They highlight certain events as vitally influencing subsequent developments.
Right, and maybe casting other events as crucial foreshadowing.
Yeah, and presenting still others as the natural, inevitable outcome of what preceded them.
Okay, let me try an analogy here.
Yeah.
Let's say I'm reading a massive city phone book.
Okay, a phone book.
Yeah, the phone book has millions of facts, perfectly ordered alphabetically. I can find the entry for Adams, and I can find the entry for Zeller. But there is absolutely no plot.
None at all.
Right, there's no connection between Adams and Zeller other than the alphabet. So, using Walsh's concept, the historian's job is to look at the historical phone book and find the underlying plot.
That is a perfect analogy. They transform what Walsh calls a series of entries in a card index into a connected, breathing story with recognizable themes.
That makes total sense.
And Walsh points out this historical narrative will probably never have the perfect, polished unity of a written play or a novel. Real life is just too messy.
Right, people are complicated.
But it must contain recognizable causal themes. You hear this in the vocabulary historians use. Phrases like, this event becomes intelligible when we take into account, or this policy naturally led to.
Or, still more significant, was.
Yes. All those transitional phrases point to the explanatory nature of their work. To explain an event is to render it intelligible. It's finding meaning in material that initially looked like pure noise.
The text provides some very concrete examples of the kinds of questions that force this narrative building. Walsh mentions the sorts of questions history professors ask on exams.
Yeah, he has a couple of great ones.
Like, what difference did it make to the policies of Gladstone that he was a high churchman? Or, what was the significance of the career of Stresemann?
Analyzing those specific questions reveals the engine of historical methodology. Asking about William Gladstone's status as a high churchman isn't a trivia question about where he spent his Sunday mornings.
Right, it's not a fun fact.
Exactly. It's demanding that the historian draw a direct analytical line connecting Gladstone's deeply held internal religious beliefs to the external political policies he enacted as prime minister. It demands a demonstration of influence.
And the question about Gustav Stresemann works the same way. Asking about his career's significance requires the historian to place his diplomatic actions within the volatile context of 20th century European politics.
Exactly. Did his economic policies genuinely ease Weimar Republic tensions, or did they inadvertently set the stage for later crises? A simple timeline cannot answer that.
You have to weave a web of influence and outcome. So the historian is acting like a forensic detective. They arrive at the crime scene of history, see the broken glass, the footprints, and figure out how it all connects.
That's a great way to picture it.
They're looking for cause and effect, just like a physicist investigating a collision. You drop an apple, gravity causes it to fall. Pass a harsh tax law, it causes a revolt. That seems like a very straightforward scientific way to look at causation.
It does, but here is where the detective analogy falls short and where the philosophy of history gets incredibly dense.
Okay, lay it on me.
In a broad sense, a significant historical narrative is a causal narrative. But Walsh explicitly warns us that historical causation cannot be confused with scientific causation.
Why not? Cause and effect is cause and effect, isn't it?
Not exactly. The notion of cause in history is vastly more complicated and infinitely more human than the notion of cause in physics. To articulate why, Walsh actually bypasses modern science entirely.
Like, really? Where does he go?
He reaches back to antiquity. He uses Aristotle's complex framework of causation.
Bringing ancient Greek philosophy into modern historical archives. Okay, let's break down this Aristotelian framework. How does it separate the historian from the physicist?
Well, Aristotle recognized that when we ask why something happened, we are actually asking several radically different types of questions that just happen to share the same label.
Right. Why is a loaded word.
Exactly. He identified multiple categories of causation. Walsh creates three specific historical examples to demonstrate how three of Aristotle's causes, efficient, formal, and final, apply directly to the work of a historian.
Let's walk through those exact examples from the text so we can see the mechanics here.
Okay, the first example is a classic economic statement. The industrial disputes of the 1920s were, in part at least, responsible for the economic difficulties of the early 1930s.
Okay, that feels completely intuitive. It's the domino effect. Event A strikes event B.
And that is Aristotle's efficient causation.
Yeah.
It's the most mechanical, straightforward kind of cause. You account for a massive historical event, the economic depression, by pointing to an antecedent event, the industrial strikes.
One domino falls into the next.
Precisely.
But efficient cause doesn't really explain the human element, does it? If the strikes caused the depression, that tells me what happened, but it doesn't tell me why the people involved reacted the way they did. There has to be another layer.
And that gap brings us to the second category. Walsh's second example is highly psychological. He writes, Hitler's overweening vanity explains his failure to see how perilous was the German situation after Stalingrad.
Now, obviously, we're just impartially quoting the text's academic examples here. But in this case, the cause isn't an external event like a labor strike. The cause is an internal personality trait, vanity.
Exactly. This illustrates what Aristotle called formal causation, which modern philosophers frequently call dispositional causation.
Dispositional, like someone's disposition.
Right. To clarify, Walsh references a philosopher named Mr. Gardner who uses a simple physical model. The glass broke because it was brittle.
Okay, let's examine that glass. The brittleness didn't throw a rock. It didn't swing a hammer. The brittleness is entirely passive. It's just an inherent quality the glass possesses.
Yes. The rock striking the window is the efficient cause. But the brittleness of the glass is the formal or dispositional cause. It explains why the glass shattered instead of merely denting or bouncing the rock away.
Oh, I see.
In historical analysis, Walsh argues that broad cultural phenomena like Spartan xenophobia or pervasive nationalism function exactly like the brittleness of the glass.
They are the underlying conditions.
They're the deeply ingrained dispositions of a society or a leader that dictate how they will react to a specific external shock. In the Stalingrad example, the military defeat is the rock. The vanity is the brittleness. It's the dispositional flaw that made a rational assessment impossible.
That is fascinating. So efficient cause is the event that strikes. Formal cause is the pre-existing condition that dictates the reaction. That covers the mechanics and the psychology. So what is the third category?
The third is what Aristotle called final causation. Walsh's example here is diplomatic. The Russian refusal of martial aid becomes intelligible when seen as part of a wider policy of withdrawal from the bourgeois world.
Again, purely an academic example from the author. But how does that differ from the first two causes?
Well, here the historian isn't pointing backward to a previous domino falling, nor are they pointing inward to a passive personality trait like brittleness.
So where are they pointing?
They're pointing forward. They are specifying the wider purpose or purposes of the historical actors. They are illuminating the end goal, the final destination that the actors were deliberately trying to reach.
Okay, let me test an analogy here. If I pick up a rock and throw it through a window...
The physicist cares about the rock.
Right. A physicist only cares about the efficient and formal causes, the mass and velocity of the rock, the tensile brittleness of the glass. But the historian, looking at that exact same event, doesn't care about the physics.
Not at all.
The historian wants to know why I threw the rock. Was I trying to burgle the house? Was it political protest? Was I just trying to get the homeowner's attention? The historian is searching for my intention.
And that distinction is the beating heart of historical philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
During the scientific revolution, final causation, the idea that objects have internal purposes, was violently expelled from physics.
Right. A falling apple doesn't want to reach the ground.
Exactly. It's just acted upon by gravity. But in history, final causation is paramount. Walsh points out that when we analyze human history, it's actually far more accurate to say we are giving the reason for an action rather than specifying its cause.
A reason versus a cause, That's a huge shift in perspective.
It is, and this heavy reliance on human intention, on conscious reasons rather than mechanical laws, led some philosophers to take a highly radical stance.
Really? Like what?
It led them to argue that the word cause should be entirely eradicated from the historian's vocabulary.
Eradicating the word cause entirely. But that sounds like it would completely paralyze the historian. I mean, if you can't talk about cause and effect, how do you build that significant narrative if you just spent 20 minutes defining?
It sounds totally contradictory until you look at the philosopher Walsh introduces to explain this view, Professor Oakeshott.
Okay, what's Oakeshott's deal?
To grasp his radical argument, you have to understand the immense psychological shadow cast by the scientific revolution and thinkers like David Hume. Prior to that revolution, medieval thinkers actually used Aristotle's formal and final causes to explain the natural world.
Oh, like saying rain fell because its purpose was to water the earth.
Exactly. But the scientific revolution proved that assigning purpose to nature was just biological projection. It stripped the universe down to efficient causation, the pure billiard ball model. Ball A strikes ball B.
And because that billiard ball model allowed us to build bridges and go to the moon, philosophers became obsessed with it. They decided it was the only valid way to use the word cause.
That is Oakeshott's core grievance. The massive success of the scientific method blinded philosophers to the fact that human beings do not operate like billiard balls.
They're a bit more complicated than that.
Just a bit.
Yeah.
While there is a minor place in history for efficient causation, like a severe drought causing a crop failure, that mechanical concept simply doesn't possess the explanatory power for the historian that it does for the physicist.
Because history is fundamentally about conscious human beings.
Right. So questions about internal purposes, hidden intentions, complex policies, and desired ends are the primary material. Walsh says the historian's standard move when deciphering a puzzling event is to painstakingly reconstruct the thoughts of the agents concerned.
They basically have to perform a kind of intellectual time travel. They have to get completely inside the event, put on the clothes of the historical agent, and view the landscape exactly as that person saw it in that moment.
And achieving that empathetic reconstruction accomplishes two vital things. First, it renders the isolated action intelligible. You finally understand why the person made that choice.
And the second thing?
Second, it intrinsically links that specific action with other actions that embody the exact same idea. It allows the historian to locate the event in its proper context.
You can prove a bizarre political speech fits perfectly with earlier and later events as part of a deliberate policy, rather than just being a random outburst. But wait, historians aren't mind readers, and the people they are studying are dead. What happens when the archives fail? What if the letters burned or the person was completely erratic and the historian simply cannot reconstruct their internal thought process?
Walsh addresses this methodological crisis directly. He explains that before you can successfully reconstruct what a person thought, you have to meticulously specify the external situation they were in and the internal state of mind they brought to it.
Okay, setting the stage.
Right. But when the thoughts remain hidden, the historian is forced to rely on external physical forces. They have to point to the fact that the leader was suffering from a severe illness or chronically exhausted or operating under blackmail.
Oh, I see.
They also have to lean heavily on formal causation, permanent features of the person's character, noting they were naturally rash or pathologically optimistic.
So they swap out the final cause, the intention, for an efficient cause like illness, or a formal cause like a rash disposition, just to plug the hole in the narrative.
They do, but Walsh emphasizes that professional historians consider this a severe compromise. When a historian is forced to rely on external factors because they can't penetrate the actual thought process, they are settling for what Walsh calls a pis-aller.
A pis-aller, the French term for a last resort.
Exactly. A makeshift, inferior solution. It's the emergency backup plan when the true work of history understanding intention is blocked.
And this heavy reliance on intention is what motivated Oakeshott's campaign to ban the word cause.
Yes. Walsh admits Oakeshott's ban is an overreaction, but he defends the spirit of the slogan. It's a vital, constant reminder that historical understanding is never truly achieved until the historian manages to get inside the events and view them through the eyes of the agents.
If the historian remains entirely external, observing troop movements and the signing of papers like a physicist watching atoms collide, they've failed their primary task.
Exactly.
Walsh uses an incredibly vivid analogy in the text to cement this difference between the external observer and the internal historian. He brings in a meteorologist.
Oh, this analogy perfectly captures the absurdity of mixing the disciplines. Walsh proposes a scenario. Imagine walking up to a professional meteorologist and asking them, what was the point of that prolonged spell of cold weather last week?
The meteorologist would think you were joking, or they'd start talking about cold fronts and low-pressure systems. Weather doesn't possess a point. It doesn't have an intention or a hidden agenda.
The question is fundamentally meaningless in natural science. But Walsh continues, if you walk up to a historian and ask the exact same structural question, what was the point of that prolonged period of diplomatic activity? The historian doesn't blink.
Right, because they know instantly that you are demanding an answer rooted in the purposes and intentions of the specific human beings involved. They know exactly how to hunt for that final cause.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is, because this isn't just academic theory. This is how we navigate our daily social lives. When you're sitting at your desk trying to decipher bizarre office politics or figuring out why a close friend suddenly canceled plans, you are not acting like a physicist.
No, not at all.
You aren't calculating the firing of synapses in their brain. You are acting as an amateur historian. You're desperately trying to reconstruct their internal mindset to find the point of their behavior.
We are all practicing historians in our daily social interactions. However, Walsh is acutely aware that dealing with human passions, fears, and hopes opens the historian up to a serious critique.
Because it's hard to be objective.
Exactly. Because historians are humans studying other humans, there's a pervasive assumption that their work can't be objective. We naturally feel a thrill at the story of a daring rescue and deep moral revulsion when studying a genocide.
You can't just turn that off.
Right. We cannot look at profound vice and virtue with the cold, dead eyes of a chemist watching a liquid change color in a beaker.
I mean, if I'm spending 10 years of my life reading the diaries of someone who suffered through a horrific war, my own emotional baggage has to seep into the narrative I'm constructing.
Walsh readily admits that this inescapable human empathy adds an enormous layer of difficulty to attaining true historical understanding. The passions of the historian are a real contaminating factor.
So how do they deal with it?
Well, he vigorously defends the profession, insisting that this emotional reality doesn't invalidate the discipline. In their detailed, rigorous work, a working historian is heavily policed by their peers. They are expected to be as impersonal and objective as any laboratory scientist.
Meaning every single conclusion must be chained to verifiable evidence in the archives.
Precisely. The working historian conspicuously fights shy of trying to see history as a grand moral whole. They keep their heads down, concerned entirely with establishing the facts and the immediate localized connections.
That paints a very clear picture of the everyday historian. They're painstakingly working in the trenches, linking specific actions to specific intentions within very tight confines of time and space.
Very tight confines.
But that intense focus feels incredibly narrow. What happens when human curiosity takes over and people decide to step out of the trench? What happens when theorists try to apply this search for meaning, not just to a single diplomatic meeting, but to the entire sprawling timeline of the human species?
When you zoom out to that cosmic scale, you cross the Rubicon. You leave the rigorous discipline of history and enter the wildly speculative realm of the philosophy of history.
And this is the core of Walsh's essay.
It is the absolute core. He draws an impenetrable diamond-hard line between two concepts that sound identical but are fundamentally opposed: finding meaning in history versus discovering the meaning of history.
Meaning in versus meaning of. It sounds like a debate over semantics, but you're saying this is the key to the whole puzzle.
It is the conceptual hinge upon which everything we've discussed turns. Finding meaning in history is the grueling, localized work we just spent half an hour dissecting. It's what everyday historians do when they ask, how does this specific event fit into its immediate context?
The historian searches for significance strictly within an artificially limited boundary of time and space.
Exactly. Just like the Stressman example. When a student asks about Stressman, they're asking about the context of 20th century Europe.
They aren't asking how Stressman connects to the Ming Dynasty or the building of the pyramids. The inquiry is fenced in.
Fenced in. And that fencing in is what makes the discipline functional. Periodization, the act of brutally chopping the endless flow of time into manageable, distinct blocks, is a mandatory tool for the working historian.
You have to draw a line somewhere.
Right. But seeking the meaning of history abandons all fences. The philosophers and theologians who engage in this speculation refuse to be bound by context. They want to know what the entire human story adds up to.
They want the whole picture.
They want to scrutinize the complete process from the dawn of man to the end of days. And Walsh argues that the moment you drop the context, the word meaning undergoes a massive semantic mutation.
How does the definition of the word change?
Within the history department, asking, does history make sense, simply means, can we find the specific causes and intentions behind this specific event? But if you ask a philosopher, does history make sense, regarding the totality of human existence, you are asking a deeply emotional, spiritually loaded question.
It becomes much heavier.
Walsh states it quite bluntly. To say that history as a whole makes sense is usually just a disguised way of saying that we feel morally satisfied when we contemplate it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Conversely, to assert that history is meaningless is to proclaim that the endless suffering of the past offends our moral susceptibilities and deeply depresses us.
To use a visual analogy, it sounds like the everyday historian is standing inches away from a massive canvas. They're obsessively analyzing a single brushstroke, figuring out the angle of the brush and how the blue paint blends into the yellow paint next to it. They're finding meaning in the painting.
Right.
But the philosopher of history has walked out of the museum entirely. They're standing on a hill, looking at the architecture of the building, demanding to know if the entire museum spells out a hidden message from God.
That captures the disparity perfectly. To further illustrate how incompatible these two pursuits are, Walsh draws a brilliant parallel with the natural sciences.
Okay, let's hear it.
Working scientists operate on the bedrock assumption that nature is orderly, that if you look closely enough, all physical events can be brought under predictable laws. But then you have grand metaphysical philosophers like Hegel.
Right, Hegel.
Hegel looked at nature and decided it must be intelligible in a much more profound spiritual sense. He believed he could look at natural phenomena and see reflections of what he called the logical idea. He believed he could deduce the ultimate cosmic point of there being a physical universe at all.
That sounds like a beautiful poem, but if I'm an engineer trying to build a suspension bridge, Hegel's logical idea isn't going to help me calculate the load-bearing capacity of steel cables.
It is completely useless to the engineer. And that is exactly Walsh's point. Whatever profound spiritual value Hegel's speculations might possess, they have absolutely zero bearing on scientific work proper.
The working scientist's need to understand nature is totally divorced from philosophers' need to understand nature.
Exactly. No credible university would ever make Hegel's metaphysical musings compulsory reading in an astrophysics curriculum.
So bringing that parallel back to our archives.
When a metahistorian asks whether history has a meaning in this grand cosmic sense, meaning as a unified destiny, they are asking a question that the working historian simply does not care about. The quest for the meaning of history is an extra-historical pursuit, just as Hegel's quest was extra-scientific.
It's a different game entirely.
Yes. Walsh insists this distinction is critical because the failure to recognize it is the primary source of the massive, often bitter misunderstandings between professional historians and speculative theorists. The theorists genuinely believe they are doing history, and the professional historians look at them as if they're practicing astrology.
Well, who exactly are these theorists standing outside the museum looking for the hidden message?
Walsh divides them into two broad camps. The first camp consists of theorists who desperately seek to discover constant, unbreakable factors governing all historical change. They're hunting for historical laws that mimic the laws of physics.
Okay. And the second camp?
The second, even more ambitious camp wants to find a single, unified plot or pattern in the whole course of historical development. They want to mathematically prove that humanity is marching toward a morally approvable goal.
Let's examine the first group, the seekers of historical laws. Who are the big names here, and what kind of laws did they think they discovered?
These are thinkers who believed they found the master key to human behavior in a single governing variable. Some proposed that race was the engine of history. Others claimed climate dictated the rise and fall of empires. The text explicitly names three titans of this approach: Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, and Arnold Toynbee.
And you mentioned earlier that professional historians view these grand laws with intense hostility. Why the animosity?
The hostility stems from the arrogance of the theorists. The search for these grand laws was often driven by a belief that traditional archive-based history was pathetic, unscientific, and desperately needed to be reformed.
Oh, I see.
Thinkers like Auguste Comte looked down on the meticulous, context-bound work of the historians and declared it primitive. They wanted to elevate history to the status of a hard science by discovering unbreakable laws of human sociology.
Walsh points out a rather embarrassing, fatal flaw in this grand scientific ambition, doesn't he?
He points out the most fatal flaw possible. Despite centuries of incredibly dense writing, massive volumes of theory, and endless academic posturing, no one has yet produced a single reputable example of an historical law.
Not a single one. That seems impossible given the intellect of the people working on it. What about the famous frameworks? Didn't Marx establish laws of economics that predicted social changes?
Walsh takes the most famous examples to task directly to prove they are illusions. He looks at Comte's law of the three stages, Marx's laws regarding economic factors, and Toynbee's famous law of challenge and response.
And what's his verdict?
He argues that none of these frameworks actually meet the rigorous criteria of a true scientific law. They are, at best, isolated generalizations, completely lacking the complex, interlocking matrix of a real scientific theory.
Let's focus on Karl Marx because his theories obviously fundamentally reshaped the 20th century, and he claimed his work was purely scientific materialism.
Yeah.
How does Walsh deconstruct Marx's historical law?
Well, Marx proposed a law stating that the continuous development of the forces of production must eventually render the existing social relations of production obsolete, and this unbearable tension inevitably results in fundamental, revolutionary social change.
On paper, that sounds like a mechanical law of thermodynamics applied to society. Pressure builds in the boiler until the valve explodes. It sounds incredibly plausible. Why does Walsh say it fails as a scientific law?
It fails on the bedrock principle of scientific inquiry, falsifiability. A true scientific law must have strict, precise definitions so that you can design an experiment to test if it's false.
Right. If I say water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, you can test that and prove me wrong if it doesn't.
Exactly. Walsh points out that Marx never clearly defined what specific metric constitutes a crucial development in the forces of production. He left the core variables incredibly vague.
Oh. If the variables are vague, the law is just a moving goalpost. If a revolution happens in a country, the Marxists can say, behold, the forces of production reached a crucial development. The law works.
Yeah.
But if decades pass and no revolution happens, they don't admit the law is flawed. They just say, the development simply isn't crucial enough yet. We must wait.
That is exactly the trap. Because the law is unfalsifiable, it's permanently insulated from empirical failure. They're never quite sure if the prophesied revolution is imminent or centuries away.
It's convenient.
Very. Walsh argues that the only reason this massive vagueness doesn't deeply embarrass the theorists is that they are not actually treating the theory as an empirical hypothesis. They're treating it as revealed dogma. It functions in their minds exactly like a religious prophecy, completely immune to rigorous scientific testing.
Okay, let's look at another titan. Arnold Toynbee wrote a multi-volume, seemingly endless study of history that was incredibly popular. His grand theory was the law of challenge and response.
Toynbee proposed that civilizations rise or fall based entirely on how effectively they respond to severe environmental or social challenges. It's a very seductive, intuitive idea.
It makes sense on a basic level.
It does. But Walsh argues that it falls into the exact same trap of catastrophic vagueness. The law Toynbee puts forward is so nebulous that it can be applied with equal justice everywhere, which means it fundamentally explains nothing.
Think of it like reading a daily horoscope.
A horoscope, yeah.
If I open the paper and my horoscope says, you will face a challenge today and your emotional response will dictate your future, that statement is guaranteed to be true. If I hit traffic, that's a challenge. If I spill coffee on my shirt, that's a challenge.
If you have a hostile meeting with your boss, challenge.
Exactly. The framework is so unbelievably broad that I can map it onto literally any event in my day. But because it applies to everything, it has zero predictive power. It is scientifically useless.
The horoscope is the perfect analog for Toynbee's historical law. If you are a devout follower of Toynbee, you will suddenly see challenge and response everywhere you look in the historical record, because the definition is pliable enough to fit any scenario.
If an empire falls, they failed the challenge. If they rise, they met the challenge.
Right. It is circular logic masquerading as a profound historical mechanism.
So if these grand historical laws fail so spectacularly when subjected to basic scientific scrutiny, why do these brilliant thinkers keep inventing them? And why do millions of people eagerly consume them?
That question leads us to the psychological core of the issue. We arrive at what Walsh terms the apocalyptic twist.
The apocalyptic twist.
He notes something very revealing. You could, theoretically, search for historical laws in a cold, emotionally detached, purely sociological spirit. You wouldn't need to assign any moral value to the laws you found.
But they don't do that.
No. It is incredibly telling that both Marx and Toynbee, who start their massive works writing like detached, objective sociologists, inevitably twist their theories into profound, moralized, apocalyptic visions of the future.
They can't help themselves. They start by looking for the gears of the machine, but they end up trying to guess the mind of the creator.
Precisely. Marx gives his sociology an apocalyptic twist by declaring that the inevitable, mathematically certain outcome of the class struggle is the utopian classless society. The law isn't just a mechanism of change, it's an engine driving humanity toward moral perfection.
And Toynbee.
Toynbee performs a similar pivot in the later volumes of his work. He stops analyzing the mechanics of civilizations and starts questioning their ultimate spiritual purpose, pondering whether civilizations merely exist to give birth to higher religions.
So the question, does history make sense, which started as a dry inquiry into whether there are recurrent patterns, mutates into a desperate plea. Please tell me there is a grand pattern that justifies all this suffering.
It is entirely driven by psychological desperation. Human beings look back at the oceans of blood, the centuries of miseries, the devastating plagues, and the brutal wars that comprise so much of the historical record, and our minds violently rebel against the idea that it was all pointless.
We want it to mean something.
We demand that it serve some higher good purpose. The philosopher of history steps in to satisfy that demand. Their true, unstated task is to discern this hidden purpose and to weave a narrative showing how every tragic detail contributed toward a grand moral accomplishment.
Walsh points out that this urge is deeply ingrained in our cultural DNA, right?
He highlights the Christian conception of history as the ultimate blueprint for this mindset. In that framework, history is a grand authored drama proceeding strictly from the creation, peaking at the incarnation, and resolving at the last judgment.
Every event has a place in the plan.
Exactly. Every single event, no matter how tragic, has a specific intended place. Walsh argues that theories like the secular doctrine of inevitable human progress are just the exact same psychological architecture, stripped of the overt theology.
But these modern theorists don't claim to be theologians receiving divine revelation. They claim they are scientists. How do they justify these sweeping apocalyptic claims?
This is where Walsh deploys the most fatal question in his philosophical arsenal. He confronts these speculative theorists and asks them, is the foundation of your grand theory a priori or empirical?
Let's make sure we define those terms clearly because they are crucial here.
An a priori argument is a conclusion you devise purely from logic and reason without needing to observe the messy physical world. Mathematics is entirely a priori.
You don't need to physically measure every triangle on Earth to know that their internal angles always add up to 180 degrees.
Right. You know it by the definition of the concept. An empirical argument, conversely, is entirely dependent on real-world observation. You cannot deduce an empirical truth in an armchair. You have to go out, gather the data, run the experiment, and let the facts dictate the conclusion.
So when Walsh traps the meta-historians with this question, which path do they choose?
They invariably claim the empirical mantle. They proudly assert that their grand, morally satisfying conclusions rest firmly and objectively on the hard facts of the historical record.
But Walsh doesn't buy that for a second.
He absolutely guts this defense. He points out that it's painfully obvious to any trained historian that these theorists' reading of the facts is highly selective and practically predetermined. They are violently vulnerable to the charge that they aggressively cherry-pick the historical record to suit their magnificent thesis.
I love the metaphor Walsh uses here. He describes the totality of human history as a sea of fact.
It is a devastatingly accurate image. He writes, the sea of fact is apparently so vast that it is always possible to fish up some fact or other to support no matter how extravagant a view.
That's so true. When you really conceptualize the scope of human history, billions of lives lived over thousands of years, millions of days of trade, endless wars, countless quiet moments, infinite written records. It truly is a bottomless ocean of data.
Yeah, you can find anything you want in there.
Right. If you build a massive fishing net designed to only catch red fish, you can drag that net through the ocean for a few decades, throw back all the blue, yellow, and green fish, and eventually dump a mountain of red fish on the pier. You can point to that mountain and scream, look, I have empirical scientific proof that the ocean only contains red fish.
And no one can deny that you caught those fish in the ocean. The facts themselves are real, but the conclusion you draw from them is a massive, deliberate distortion of reality.
It's like putting a thick blue filter over your camera lens, taking 1,000 pictures of a vibrant, multicolored city, and using those photos as empirical proof that the world is entirely blue. You haven't discovered a truth about the world. You've just violently imposed your own filter onto the data.
In philosophical terms, you have brought an idea fix to the table.
An idea
A
fix.
fixed idea, an intellectual obsession that you cannot shake. Walsh argues that a theorist possessed by an idea fix will always contrive a way to view the facts, no matter how contradictory they actually are, exactly as they need to see them to maintain their worldview.
They bend reality to fit the theory.
Yeah. Now, Walsh is a careful scholar, and he cautions that simply dismissing giants like Hegel or Toynbee as men blinded by an idea fix is slightly uncharitable. They are not careless frauds. They are incredibly learned, deeply intelligent individuals.
But they're not operating like scientists.
Exactly. When a scientist encounters an awkward fact that contradicts their hypothesis, they are supposed to abandon the hypothesis. When a meta-historian encounters an awkward fact, they perform incredible mental gymnastics to force it into their grand framework.
This leaves us in a very strange place. We've established that these massive, sweeping theories of history fail as rigorous science because they are unfalsifiable, and they fail as objective history because they cherry-pick from the sea of facts to satisfy a psychological need.
It's a double failure, analytically.
So if they are fundamentally flawed on both fronts, what is the point of reading them? Are these thousands of pages of theory just a colossal waste of our time?
That is the ultimate conclusion of the essay, and Walsh provides a deeply surprising, almost beautiful answer. He asks, if these works can neither be adequately confirmed nor clearly refuted, what possible value do they have?
And what's his answer?
His answer is that they possess the immense transformative value that belongs to any great system of metaphysical thought.
Metaphysics. That is a word that gets thrown around a lot. How is Walsh defining the value of metaphysics here?
He is using it to describe an attempt to provide a comprehensive set of principles through which every kind of human experience can be interpreted. A metaphysician isn't offering a scientific formula, they are advocating a totally unique way of looking at the world.
So they're handing you a new set of interpretive lenses.
Exactly. The world will physically look the same, but it will appear radically different according to the metaphysical point of view you adopt.
I'm thinking of those classic optical illusions. You stare at a drawing, and it clearly looks like a duck. The lines on the paper are static facts. But then someone tells you to shift your perspective and look at the duck's beak as if it were a pair of rabbit ears.
Oh, that's a great example.
Suddenly, your brain snaps, and the duck vanishes, replaced by a rabbit. The empirical facts, the ink on the paper, haven't changed a single millimeter. But the interpretative framework has completely shifted your reality.
That is the exact mechanism of metaphysical value. Walsh points out that great thinkers like Hegel or Toynbee don't just arbitrarily invent these frameworks out of thin air to trick people. Their theories are born from deep, genuine meditation upon the real tragedies and triumphs of the past.
It comes from a real place.
It does. They have an initial, profound insight, and the sheer intellectual force of their writing comes from the incredible persistence with which they apply that single insight to the entirety of human existence. They urge us to look at the chaotic facts of history through their specific lens, promising that if we do, the chaos will resolve into perspective.
So their value isn't in giving us the true mathematical answer. Their value is in shocking us out of our default way of seeing things.
Exactly. And Walsh stresses that you do not need to be fully persuaded by the theorist to experience this profound intellectual benefit. You do not have to convert and become a devout, card-carrying Hegelian or a strict Marxist to extract immense value from wrestling with their texts.
Because even if it's flawed, it still changes how you think.
Yeah, it's incredibly easy to poke logical holes in their grand systems. But exposing those flaws doesn't negate the feeling that, while reading them, your own view of the human condition has been clarified and expanded. In this realm, Walsh says it is useless to speak of a theory being objectively true or false.
There's a sliver of truth in every grand view.
The real metric is whether the theorist's vision produces conviction in the reader.
So if they aren't scientists, and they aren't everyday historians, what are they?
Walsh delivers his final, elegant categorization. We must learn from the great metaphysician in the exact same way we learn from a master portrait painter, or a deeply philosophical poet.
A portrait painter. That cuts right to the heart of it. If I want the exact, empirical, physically accurate dimensions of a person's face, I take a high-resolution photograph.
Right.
That photograph is the everyday historian working in the archives. It is factual, localized, and precise. But a master portrait painter might look at that same person and deliberately distort the proportions.
They alter the facts.
Exactly. They might use unrealistic, vivid colors, or cast heavy, dramatic shadows where physics says there shouldn't be shadows. They're distorting the empirical facts, but in doing so, they capture the deep emotional essence of the person's character in a way the cold photograph never could. They're presenting a highly subjective, interpretative vision of a deeper truth.
It is the triumph of insight over mere accuracy. And Walsh insists that if we are to be fair to these sweeping metaphysical meditations upon history, we must accurately identify the literary genre to which they belong.
We have to judge them for what they actually are.
Right. We must realize that despite Arnold Toynbee's own repeated stubborn assertions, he was not a postmodern Western historian. He was not a working historian of any kind. You cannot establish or refute his main conclusions by simply digging up a new cache of letters in a Parisian archive.
He isn't cataloging the past. He is weaving an entirely new mythology for the present.
Yes. Walsh marvels at how highly individual, almost mystical Toynbee's methods actually are. Toynbee heavily relies on deep mythology to establish his premise that the genesis of civilizations are, as he writes, particular beats of a general rhythmical pulsation which runs all through the universe.
Rhythmical pulsations running through the universe. I can guarantee you that no historian has ever found the source citation for a universal pulsation in a stack of 19th century tax records.
It is pure poetry. Walsh observes that when a writer starts talking about universal pulsations, we are clearly dealing with a deeply personal, spiritual vision rather than a sober scientific hypothesis.
He's a philosopher hierophant.
A high priest of philosophy, exactly, not a grounded investigator. And Walsh dryly notes that the delusion that Toynbee's later volumes are actual contributions to empirical history is so incredibly easy to see through, it's genuinely astonishing that Toynbee himself remained blind to it.
So if we strip away the author's own delusion that it is hard science, how do we correctly engage with a work like that?
We read it as we read epic poetry. We read it to see if the author's sweeping vision produces conviction within our own minds. And Walsh argues that, at the absolute lowest estimate, engaging with a writer of such immense breadth of knowledge and majestic sweep of vision will inevitably lead to a diminution of parochialism.
A diminution of parochialism.
Yeah.
Meaning, reading these grand, flawed theories forces us to stop being so incredibly narrow-minded and provincial. It shatters our little comfortable bubbles.
It forces your mind to stretch across centuries. It compels you to look beyond your immediate modern surroundings and your deeply ingrained cultural assumptions. It can reveal breathtaking, hitherto unsuspected connections across vast stretches of time and space.
It gives you a sympathetic understanding of the total human journey.
An understanding that you could never derive from a hyper-focused, localized history book. Now, Walsh is intellectually ruthless, even with himself. He concludes the essay by confessing that reading Toynbee didn't quite produce this transcendent effect for him personally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he wryly suggests that Toynbee will likely be remembered not as a revolutionary new Hegel, but merely as another Herbert Spencer.
Which is a devastatingly polite academic burn, effectively calling his work an evolutionary dead end. But the overarching philosophical point survives the burn. The immense value of the meta-historian is the value of the visionary poet. And I want to connect this directly back to you, the listener, navigating your own sea of facts today.
It's so relevant right now.
It is. You do not have to believe that a grand philosophical system, a political ideology, or a sweeping sociological theory is 100% empirically, flawlessly true to have your eyes blown wide open by it. Sometimes the mere exercise of forcing yourself to try on a radically different interpretative lens is the only way to break out of your own invisible biases.
But you have to try on the glasses.
Exactly. You can read a Marxist interpretation of the Industrial Revolution or a purely environmental interpretation of the fall of Rome. And even if you ultimately reject the grand premise, the intellectual friction of looking through that bizarre lens will reveal shadows, highlights, and connections in the historical fabric that you would have otherwise been completely blind to.
It builds your cognitive flexibility. It serves as a constant, humbling reminder that the vast, chaotic sea of facts can be navigated in a multitude of ways, and that your default perspective is just one small boat on a very large ocean.
Let's take a deep breath and summarize the incredible, sprawling journey we have been on today. We started by acknowledging that universal modern feeling of being utterly overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of current events and historical data.
The false binary of history.
Right, the idea that history must be either a perfectly unified destiny or a meaningless void. Then we zoomed all the way in to observe the rigorous, everyday historian painstakingly working in the archives, building localized, significant narratives by tracing causal chains and reconstructing the hidden internal intentions of human agents.
We explored Aristotle's ancient causes.
Realizing that while physics relies on the mechanical domino effect of efficient cause, history requires final cause, the ultimate why, behind human action.
And from that microscopic level, we took a massive, dizzying step back. We crossed the philosophical boundary from finding meaning in specific, fenced-in historical contexts to the grand, incredibly hubristic attempt to discover the overarching meaning of history as a totality.
We watched as the grand scientific laws of history proposed by titans like Marx and Toynbee crumbled under the weight of their own unfalsifiable vagueness.
We uncovered the psychological desperation behind these theories, the profound human need to extract a morally satisfying narrative from the tragedy of the past, leading theorists to cherry-pick their data from the vast sea of facts.
But ultimately, we found redemption for these theorists.
We did. We realized that while their grand laws fail spectacularly as rigid science, they succeed brilliantly as metaphysical poetry. They provide interpretative frameworks that, much like a masterfully distorted portrait painting, reveal deep, subjective truths about the human condition that cold, empirical data simply cannot capture.
It is a stunning synthesis of how humanity desperately tries to process its own chaotic shadow. And as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves me with a very provocative, almost unsettling thought to leave you with.
Let's hear it.
We have spent this hour seeing how everyday historians struggle to reconstruct the past by getting inside the minds of the dead, while meta-historians try to guess the grand destination of humanity from the clouds. It makes you wonder, look at your own life right now. Look at the era we are currently living through, generating more chaotic data in a single day than entire centuries did in the past.
It's a terrifying amount of data.
Hundreds of years from now, when the historians of the future look back at the unfathomable, digitized sea of facts from our decade, what will they actually see? Will they be able to trace a logical, rational chain of causes and intentions to understand why we did the bizarre things we are doing?
Or will the sheer, overwhelming volume of our chaos force those future historians to abandon logic entirely and invent a completely new, wild mythology just to make sense of us?
That is a thought to keep you staring at the ceiling tonight. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, keep looking for the hidden plot, and we'll see you next time.